Genesis. Chapter 1. Captain Harris gazed out the front viewport of the Genesis as it drifted through the inky blackness of space. He never tired of the majestic beauty, the infinite potential symbolized by the sea of stars that surrounded them. But at times like this, alone on the command bridge, he was also reminded of the dangers lurking in the great unknown. Dangers that could threaten their historic mission if they were not vigilant. Harris was jolted from his contemplation by footsteps behind him. He turned to see Dr. Chen entering the bridge. As lead scientist, Chen played a critical role in overseeing the technological needs of their journey. The two men exchanged terse greetings. Despite their long history together, they had never quite seen eye to eye. The telemetry from the gravitational sensors is still within expected parameters, Chen reported in his characteristically curt manner. No significant anomalies to report. Harris nodded, though his posture remained taut with unease. Let's hope it stays that way. We're venturing into uncharted territory now, beyond the reach of any human expedition to date out here. We have no idea what we might run into. Chen's expression flashed with mild annoyance at the captain's doomed saying, before reverting to its typical impassiveness. While space does contain unpredictable phenomena, our ship is engineered to withstand most foreseeable hazards. I have full confidence in the technology and in my team. Harris hoped the scientist was right, but he had learned over long decades of spaceflight to never take anything for granted. There was always the chance they could encounter the unforeseeable, and he worried whether the ship and crew would be ready. For now, though, he kept his concerns to himself and let Chen return to his duties. No sense borrowing trouble if it wasn't already knocking. In another section of the massive vessel, Maria Gonzalez tended to the plants in the hydroponic gardens that would sustain the crew on their century-long journey. She nurtured the seedlings and monitored their growth, coaxing them to thrive under the artificial lamps. To Maria, these plants represented life and hope. As long as they persevered, so would the colonists. Maria was so lost in her work that she didn't notice as her teenage son, Miguel, entered the garden. "When are we going to get to Terra Nova?" he complained loudly to announce his presence. "I'm sick of being cooped up on this ship." Maria sighed wearily. She wished Miguel could better appreciate the honor and purpose of their mission. "It will still be some 30 years before we reach our destination," she reminded him. "I know it's not easy, but we all have our duties to fulfill." Miguel just sulked, clearly dissatisfied with her diplomatic reply. Maria felt sympathy for her son, but there was nothing to be done. From the day they were born, the children of the Genesis were burdened with the survival of the human race and this colony mission. Their fates were intertwined with the generations before them and those yet to come. In the engineering section, Trevor Hall worked to calibrate the matter/antimatter reactor that drove the ship's propulsion systems. Precision was vital to prevent destabilization and potential disaster. Hall took pride in his work, but the weight of responsibility wore on him. One small mistake on his part could doom them all. It was enough to slowly leach the optimism from his soul, replacing it with ever-present dread. As Hall double-checked the reactor levels, Dr. Akiko Nakamura entered. As the crew psychologist, she made a habit of informally checking on her patients. "No need to worry, Trevor. All your work is exemplary," she reassured him with a comforting smile. Hall tried to return the smile, but only managed a tense grimace. "I wish I had your confidence. Even the best can miss something." His bleak outlook was set too deep to be shaken. Dr. Nakamura nodded sympathetically and left him to his work. She made a mental note to schedule some sessions to help relieve Hall's anxiety. Out here, morale was as vital as any mechanical system. Nakamura's next stop was the medical bay, where she found her colleagues' doctors. Felipe and Elena Torres analyzing test results on their computer. Married for 25 years, they moved and operated in perfect synchronicity, true partners in every endeavor. The latest tissue scans from the hibernation pods came back normal, Felipe told her. Once we ruled out any artifacts, of course, Elena added seamlessly. Can't be too careful when it comes to cold sleep bioreadings. Nakamura observed their easy banter with a tinge of envy. After all this time, she still felt like something of an outsider looking in. For all their camaraderie and team spirit, the colonists were still 250 individuals, isolated by the confines of their mission. She wondered if they would ever truly feel like a cohesive community. Only time would tell. As Nakamura left the medbay, she passed Captain Harris' son, now a man grown, on his way to the bridge for his scheduled duty shift. He nodded politely to the doctor before continuing on his way. She studied the young man, seeing hints of his father's staunch poise. But where the elder Harris' eyes held seasoned wisdom and resolve, the son still shone with the optimism and confidence of youth. He had much yet to learn when his time came to lead. On the bridge, Harris Jr. took his station as his father relinquished command to him for the day. The captain placed a proud hand on his son's shoulder, then left him in charge with an encouraging, "Steady as she goes." Harris Jr. straightened his back and took a deep breath as he accepted the mantle of responsibility. As he monitored the ship's progress, he hoped when the day came that this command truly passed to him, he would be ready for whatever trials they still had to face. Chapter 2. Over 2 centuries after the launch of the Genesis, only the descendants of the original colonists remained. None now lived who had actually set foot on humanity's homeworld. Earth was merely a mythical paradise whispered about in stories and simulations. Home to them now was this ship and the promise of the planet Terra Nova. Captain Harris IV stood on the bridge, peering out at the stars as the planet Terra Nova grew larger in the view screen. The Genesis was finally approaching its destination after so many generations adrift. He wished his ancestors were still alive to see this. But he was the last of the Harris line, the final captain to inherit both their name and mission. It was left to him to complete what they began, to guide the last remnants of humanity to their new home. At his stations nearby, lead scientist Chen monitored the descent protocols and trajectories. Like Harris, he was the last direct descendant of the original crew to bear his title, carrying the expectations of generations before. As both men understood all too well, failure was not an option. If they did not successfully navigate the hazards of these final stages and safely land the ship, their entire people would perish. Harris turned to the scientist. "What's our status, Chen?" "The ship is on course for orbital insertion." Chen quickly interpreted the stream of data flowing across his screens. "We should enter Terra Nova's atmosphere in 14 hours. The captain allowed himself a moment of satisfaction. After so long adrift among the uncaring stars, the finish line was at last in sight. But he knew well this was the most perilous part of the journey. If anything went wrong now, their people's hopes would be lost. "Understood," Harris replied, steadying his voice. "Let's make sure all decks are prepared. I want full diagnostics on our descent systems, supplies secured for landing, and the colonists briefed on what to expect." Chen inclined his head. I'll oversee the procedures personally." Without further comment, the taciturn scientist returned his focus to the tasks at hand. On the agricultural deck, Beth, descendant of the original engineer Trevor Hall, inspected the hydroponic farm. As with her ancestor generations back, Beth had inherited the vital role of maintaining the ship's critical systems. She took pride in her work, but constantly wrestled with doubts and anxiety. So much was riding on her technical skills and knowledge. What if she overlooked something crucial? As Beth verified the anchoring of the grow trays, she noticed some frayed tension wires that could fail during the stresses of planetary entry. Her heart raced at the implications. If these wires broke, they risked losing a sizable portion of food needed for the colony. The lives of her people depended on this equipment functioning properly. With obsessive care, Beth replaced the worn cables and reinforced the connections. Though her hands still shook from the close call, she gradually regained her composure and moved on to inspect the next section. She could not afford to let fear paralyze her. Too much depended on pushing past the worries that haunted her. Down in the engineering bay, Miguel's descendant manned the main control console monitoring the reactor levels. As a child, he had relished listening to the elders' stirring tales of Maria, the brave botanist and namesake who first inspired his passion for plants. He dreamed of the day he would work beside her, cultivating new life on Terra Nova. That day was nearly here, if only they could safely arrive. The reactor suddenly flashed a warning as energy spiked into the red zone. Miguel's descendant quickly adjusted the antimatter stream to stabilize the reaction before it destabilized entirely. Once the reactor was again under control, he sighed heavily, shaking off the residual adrenaline. It was yet another reminder of how fragile their existence was out here. One small misstep could unravel all Maria's hopes and dreams for this world they would soon call home. On the medical deck, Felipe and Elena's descendants prepped supplies in the med bay to deal with any injuries during landing. They were grateful to have inherited their ancestors' passion for healing and protecting life. When planetfall arrived, that purpose would be more crucial than ever. As the two doctors sealed away precious medicine and bandages for the ordeal ahead, they exchanged a look of solidarity. Together they possessed the knowledge and skill to keep their people safe. United as both partners and physicians, they would face any trial. After her own preparations were complete, Dr. Akiko Nakamura's descendant brushed aside a curtain and peered into a cabin once occupied by the original psychologist long ago. Though she had trained her whole life for this duty, Akiko sometimes felt dwarfed by her storied ancestors' legacy. How she wished she could speak to the former doctor who had safeguarded the crew's fragile sanity and spirits. Yet Akiko knew it was her turn now. When the chaos of landing commenced, her people would need her to be a calming voice of reason and comfort amidst the fear. She drew a deep breath and centered herself, ready to live up to her family name when the time came to disembark onto the soil of their new world. Chapter 3. Captain Harris IV looked around the tense faces gathered on the bridge. In a few hours, they would retrofire the engines and begin their perilous descent to Terra Nova through the atmosphere. Decades of travel across unfathomable distances had led to this singular moment. "We stand today on the threshold of human endurance and ingenuity," Harris began, letting his gaze meet each of the assembled crew in turn. "Because of the sacrifices made by our ancestors, everything they gave up and overcame, we have the opportunity here to secure the future for generations to come. Terra Nova may be an alien world, but we will make it our home. This planet is our destiny and salvation." He saw his own steadfast resolve reflected back at him from the crew. The impromptu speech seemed to steel their courage for the coming trial. They were ready. "Now let's bring the ship in and finish what our forebears started," Harris said at last. "For Earth, for Terra Nova." The crew echoed the rallying cry, then dispersed to their duty stations. Harris remained, watching the loom of Terra Nova fill the front viewport. The planet's alien geography was cloaked in shadows, its mysteries still veiled. What wonders and dangers awaited them in that unexplored land? In a few hours, they would begin to find out. Dr. Chen stayed focused on his console, scrutinizing the descent trajectory projections and propulsion calculations. "I've triple-checked the orbital insertion sequence," he reported to Harris. "We're go for initiating retro burn on your command." Harris studied the planet intently, as if seeking answers there to questions still unformed in his mind. At length he nodded. "Take us in." Chen keyed in the commands to ignite the braking thrusters. A low thrum of power reverberated through the ship's superstructure as the engines awakened for one final effort. The planet loomed larger by the second. They were committed now to seeing this through, wherever it led. On the agricultural deck, Beth watched in dismay as stored equipment broke loose from its moorings and slid across the floor from the turbulence. She desperately tried to restrain the containers, but the shaking grew worse, overwhelming her efforts. All she could do was stare helplessly as some of their precious terraforming resources careened out of reach. In engineering, warnings blared as the reactor fluctuated from the stress. Miguel's descendant raced to adjust the stabilizers before the disturbances critically disrupted the antimatter stream. If he couldn't get it contained, the resulting explosion would obliterate them all. On the medical deck, Felipe and Elena's descendants scrambled to collect scattered medical supplies rolling through the medbay. A container of force solution crashed to the floor and shattered. Every lost resource could spell disaster once they were on Terra Nova and reliant on their limited cargo. Akiko clung tightly to the arms of her chair, breathing measuredly against rising panic as the ship shuddered around her. They were utterly committed to this descent now. All she could do was maintain composure and seek inner calm, even as external chaos threatened to undo them. Through sheer force of will and training, the crew brought the crisis under control. Beth refastened the escaped cargo. Miguel's descendant kept the reactor intact. The doctors gathered the intact medical provisions they could. The ship stabilized as it pierced the outer atmosphere. On the bridge, warning alarms finally quieted, leaving only the electric ambience of monitors and comm channels. The first critical phase was complete. Harris and Chen traded taut, but relieved nods. Together, the longtime allies had overcome another potentially disastrous hurdle, as they had so many times before over their lives. Yet neither man voiced premature celebration. The greater struggle still lay ahead. Surviving the actual landing and their first days exposed on an untamed alien world would demand all the resilience and unity the colonists could muster. But united they would face it, Harris told himself silently, as generations had done before. One way or another, he would find a way to deliver these people safely home. Chapter 4. Captain Harris stood behind Chen on the bridge, vigilant eyes locked on the stream of telemetry data flowing across the scientists' screens. Their ship now sliced through Terra Nova's upper atmosphere, buffeted by violent turbulence as friction built against the hull. The navigation systems were working overtime to keep them on the correct re-entry angle toward the target landing zone. "Guidance holding steady," Chen reported, We're still on profile. Harris checked the descent timeline counting down on the main display. Let's hope we stay that way. How are you reading the atmospheric composition? Chen called up a dense spectrographic analysis. Nitrogen, oxygen, and trace greenhouse gases conforming to projections based on long-range scans. He highlighted a few spiking trace elements. There's some chemical compounds here not registered in our databases, but nothing that reads as an immediate toxicity threat. Keep monitoring, Harris ordered needlessly. Chen's vigilance was unquestioned. The ship shuddered through a rough patch of resistance before the descent smoothed somewhat. Harris clung tightly to the back of Chen's chair as the jolting briefly intensified. The scientist remained fixated on the incoming data, seemingly oblivious. A proximity alert suddenly blared as a dense silicate mass loomed in their plunging path. Harris reacted first. Evasive now. Chen rapidly initiated the orbital correction burn Harris called for, adjusting their trajectory just enough to avoid a disastrous collision. The mountain-sized asteroid passed beneath them with kilometers to spare. Nice work, Harris said, releasing his white-knuckle grip on the chair. That was too close. It appears our charts of the planet's orbital field have significant gaps, Chen noted with annoyance. The probability models will need to be revised. Harris nodded grimly. They were literally mapping the terrain as they went, with minimal margin for error. An uncharted asteroid field was just one of countless unknown perils they could face during this descent. They would need to rely on each other's strengths to overcome them. I'll have Beth in engineering begin a full diagnostic and recalibration of the external sensors, Harris stated. See if we can boost their sensitivity to identify hazards sooner. Let me know the instant you detect any other anomalies. Understood, Captain, Chen confirmed, already immersed in his analysis again. Harris clapped the scientist on the shoulder in wordless gratitude before heading below decks. Step by step, they would get through this together. In the agricultural bay, alarms blared as nutrient fluid leaked in evaporating spurts from the hydroponics system. The intense shaking had ruptured key hoses that Beth had not fully secured. She gritted her teeth at her oversight while desperately trying to clamp off the severed ends. But makeshift patches could only help so much. They were losing critical liquid needed to cultivate crops on Terra Nova. Just then the outer airlock doors cycled open, and Captain Harris hurried in. He immediately helped stabilize the damaged hoses, while Beth sealed the largest breach. Once the leak slowed to a trickle, he met her frightened gaze. "Are you all right?" he asked her kindly. Beth bit her lip, on the verge of tears. "I'm sorry, sir. I should have reinforced this equipment better." "We couldn't have predicted exactly how rough the entry would be," Harris reassured her. Harris put a comforting hand on her shoulder. "The important thing is we stopped the leak before losing it all. I need you at your best to keep this ship intact. Everything's riding on your skills as an engineer." Beth managed a shaky nod, drawing strength from his confidence in her abilities even after she'd made a critical mistake. "Thank you, sir. I won't let you down again." "I know you won't," Harris affirmed. "Now let's get these systems stabilized." Working side by side, they purged air bubbles from the fluid lines and reinforced the most vulnerable connections. Beth gradually felt her nerves settle as she lost herself in the intricate repairs. Harris' faith in her to handle this served as a touchstone to cling to amidst the chaos. With the emergency contained, Harris headed for the reactor bay to check on Miguel's descent. He found the young man sweating with concentration as he manually adjusted the antimatter stream injections to compensate for the turbulence. Miguel nearly had it contained when a power spike threatened to destabilize the reactor. Harris rushed over, and together they stabilized the readings, averting a catastrophic overload. "That was expert work," Harris told him once the danger passed. "Your ancestor would be proud." Miguel sat back heavily, overcome with relief. Knowing he had the captain's trust gave him the confidence to endure the relentless stress of this descent. Harris gripped his shoulder, sharing a look of mutual respect between two defenders of their people. No matter what, they would weather this storm. In the medical bay, Felipe and Elena's descendants had their hands full treating crew members injured when debris broke free during the turbulence. As they worked, Harris arrived to check on the status of his crew. "Just some bumps and lacerations, Captain," Elena reported. "We've already discharged the minor cases." Harris nodded. "Make sure you have everything you need. Things may get worse before we land." "We're ready for anything," Felipe said with determination as he wrapped an arm sprain. "Whatever comes, we can handle it." Harris gave them an encouraging smile, heartened by their reassuring confidence. As long as his crew kept faith in each other, they would make it through this descent together. On the bridge, Harris found Chen scrutinizing a new anomaly in the atmospheric scans. He described it as an intermittent mass permeating the lower thermosphere layers. "It may be a cloud of charged particles related to the planet's magnetosphere, but without more data, I can't draw definitive conclusions," Chen concluded with professional annoyance at the limits of his knowledge. "We've overcome the unknown before, my friend," Harris told him. "Let's decipher this new puzzle the way we always have, as partners." Chen offered a rare hint of a smile at the vote of confidence from his longtime captain. Together, their allied strengths had carried their people this far. United, they would forge ahead through the final unknowns into their destiny. Chapter 5. The bridge lights flickered as the ship hit another pocket of turbulence. Klaxons blared throughout the decks, summoning the crew to emergency posts. On the view screen, the planet's surface was a beckoning green blur through occasional breaks in the atmosphere's dense cloud cover. They had survived initial re-entry, but the final descent toward the landing zone could still prove disastrous if they did not regain control soon. "What's our status?" Harris asked tersely, gripping his seat as the bridge continued to shake. Chen analyzed the latest data with contained urgency. "We've been pulled into a decaying orbital path. The guidance systems are struggling to compensate and break free." Harris absorbed this news grimly. If they were trapped spiraling down on a deteriorating trajectory, the G-forces would intensify intolerably. And attempting any radical thruster burns to correct course this deep in the gravity well could shear the ship apart. "They've seen no way out unless—" "Your recommendations," he prompted Chen. The scientist hesitated, likely weighing the same limited, unpalatable options Harris saw. Finally, Chen straightened with that familiar look he got when an idea took shape. "I suggest a controlled venting of interior atmosphere to create brief retrothrust." Harris considered it. The sudden loss of air pressure would be hugely dangerous inside the habitable sections. But it might just nudge them out of the deadly spiral if precisely timed. "Make it happen," the captain ordered. "All decks, brace for emergency atmospheric venting on my mark." Through the ship-wide comm, Harris heard his crew acknowledge the desperate, risky measure. But there was no time for discussion. Then now. Harris commanded Chen. The scientist opened the ventilation valves on preselected lower decks. For long heartbeats, nothing happened. Then a massive lurch shuddered the ship as the expelled air created a braking force, just enough to shift their trajectory out of the decaying orbit. Warnings screamed anew as air rushed out of the depressurizing sections before emergency seals isolated them. The immediate crisis passed, but at significant cost. Harris dispatched medical teams below to check for injuries. He turned to Chen, both men shaken. Whatever treasures this planet holds, it does not give them up easily. The scientist nodded grimly, likely contemplating what other trials Terra Nova had in store for them. They had overcome the first threat by jettisoning a portion of their own preciously limited air. The opposition only seemed to grow as they neared the surface. How much more would they be forced to sacrifice? On the agricultural deck, Beth raced to check for damage from the explosive venting. She was relieved to find her critical hydroponics trays still intact and operating. But some of their seed bank containers had tumbled free, scattering across the floor with the violent shaking. Beth hurried to gather up the precious genetically engineered seeds that were vital for establishing crops on Terra Nova. As she secured the last container, the ship jolted hard once again, sending her sprawling to the floor. More containers broke open, irretrievably mixing specialized seed varieties cultivated for specific growing conditions. Beth could only watch helplessly as generations of botanical expertise were lost in moments. They would have to make do now with fewer, less ideal stock to start their new colonial farms. In the reactor bay, Miguel's descendant faced his own crisis. The repeated jolts had misaligned the magnetic constriction rings that maintained the antimatter reaction chamber. Within seconds of the first warning alarm, the rings completely gave way under the stress. Uncontrolled antimatter instantly contacted the reactor walls in a blinding flash. Miguel threw up a hand to shield his eyes from the unleashed energy torrent. When he could see again, the reactor core was a mangled wreck. Their primary power source for descent and colony operations was gone. They were on auxiliary generators now for whatever functions remain. His whole body shook with more than the quaking ship. Miguel had failed to safeguard their most critical technology and jeopardized everything. He stared helplessly at the lifeless wreckage, all their hopes now tenuous. On the medical deck, Felipe and Elena rushed to stabilize crew who had suffered decompression injuries and burns in the venting emergency. Medical data scrolled past in a blur as they worked to save all the lives they could, even through their own exhaustion. But the gravest cases had sustained trauma too severe, the damage too extensive from being at atmosphere ground zero. Felipe gritted his teeth as yet another critical patient slipped away, the monitors flatlining no matter what resuscitation aids they tried. He slammed a fist down in helpless frustration. How many more might still succumb? They could not save everyone from this onslaught. Each death left the crew that much more vulnerable to whatever trials still awaited them. Amidst the chaos, Akiko went calmly from person to person, salving mental anguish with her composed presence. Her ancestors had counseled frightened souls through perils. Now was her time to serve that same purpose. All we can do is take the next step, and have faith our journey does not end here, she told each in turn. Some gripped her hands like a lifeline before she moved to the next lost land. Steadfast, she would shepherd their spirits through this crisis, as long as strength and breath remained. Chapter 6. Captain Harris stood alone on the bridge, solemnly observing a small shrine he had erected to the crew lost in the catastrophic venting and reactor meltdown. so many promising lives cut short, just as they approached the dream of a new home. He silently vowed no further sacrifices would be asked of his people. He sensed Chen entering behind him and spoke without turning. I want your latest analysis. Will auxiliary systems provide sufficient power to reach the surface? Affirmative, though with greatly reduced reserves, Chen reported. But there is a new development. Harris turned sharply. What is it? Our orbital path continues to degrade faster than projections anticipate, and the ship's physical integrity is weakening at an unprecedented rate. Explain, Harris pressed, not liking Chen's ominous tone. The scientists called up their descent timeline, pointing to the accelerated decay rate. This goes beyond normal atmospheric stresses. It's as if some localized field is acting on the ship itself, destabilizing key systems. Harris stared at the anomalous readings, alarm growing. Could this connect to the charged particle phenomenon you detected earlier in the thermosphere? Chen nodded. It may be an interaction effect we did not account for. I will run simulations on the potential impact. Do it quickly, Harris ordered. And give me options. We need a way through this. As Chen hurried to task, Harris turned back to the shrine, steeling himself. The ship was being shaken apart around them, and his people along with it. How could he protect them from a threat permeating the very air? The planet itself seemed intent on their destruction. On the agricultural deck, Beth frowned at the sensor readings on her pad. The latest jolt had knocked their auxiliary power offline for over a minute, and the hydroponics trays showed signs of disruption. She began meticulously hand-testing each system, searching for malfunctions. When she inserted the diagnostic probe into the fluid reservoir, the tool suddenly corroded before her eyes, pitting and going brittle at an accelerated rate. Beth examined the corroded tool in confusion and growing alarm. These components were designed to withstand far harsher rigors. Some unknown agent was attacking the physical molecular structure itself. An ominous thought solidified. If it was happening to the metal and polymers here, what might be happening to the crew's own bodies? In the Medi Bay, Akiko helped Felipe and Elena treat new patients exhibiting strange symptoms. Fevers, skin lesions, and periods of mental confusion were spreading rapidly. It was unlike anything documented in their medical database. As they worked, all three struggled against intensifying exhaustion and nausea. Something was weakening them along with the rest of the ship. When Felipe's hand shook too hard to inject more painkillers for a patient, the awful truth became clear. It's all of us, Elena said, wide-eyed. Something's accelerating cellular degeneration. Akiko steadied herself against sudden lightheadedness. But what could be causing such a phenomenon? She cast her thoughts back over the mission timeline, seeking answers. Then, with chilling revelation, it came to her. The gravitational anomaly in deep space, the one the first generation reported affecting their aging, it must still be influencing us somehow. In the reactor bay, Miguel also noticed the accelerated breakdown spreading everywhere around him. Even his own body felt subtly heavier and slower in a way that couldn't just be fatigue or radiation. At this rate, complete systemic failures on the ship were imminent. When he tried to summon the energy for repairs, Miguel swayed, suddenly overcome by crushing despair. They were trapped in a deteriorating descent, vital systems corrupted beyond recovery. What options were left? Over the comm, Harris' solemn words reached them all. It appears some lingering effect of the space anomaly is intensifying decay in both the ship and crew. But we cannot lose hope now, when our destination is in reach. Fight through this trial. Our ancestors did not give up, and neither can we. Have faith in our science and in each other. We will find an answer together. His firm conviction stirred Miguel's hopes enough to push away the bleakness. If the captain still believed, so could he. Chapter 7. Captain Harris sat with Chen and Beth in the science lab, reviewing ideas to counteract the anomaly's degenerative effects. The ship-wide failure projections Chen compiled made for grim analysis. At current deterioration rates, critical systems would start crashing within hours. Time was rapidly running out. Your assessment? Harris asked, inviting dialogue. Chen steepled his fingers thoughtfully. We know the phenomenon involves some interaction with ambient gravitational forces. If we could modulate our gravity generators to temporarily alter our local gravity field, it may disrupt the effect. Harris weighed the suggestion. Their gravity control technology had never been used so aggressively. But the plan had merits. He turned to Beth. Can you reconfigure the generators safely for this? She bit her lip anxiously, but finally nodded. I think so, if we reroute non-essential systems to boost the generator's power reserves. Get started, Harris directed. It was thin hope, but their only option right now. We'll proceed on minimal operating levels until you've made the adjustments. As Beth hurried out, Chen cleared his throat. There is one other possibility, albeit higher risk. He called up an engineering simulation on the display. If we deliberately expose the ship's superstructure to precise gravimetric stress, it may realign the atomic decay sequences. Harris studied the theoretical application of force loads on the ship's frame. Chen was right. If they improperly calculated the stresses, the ship could disintegrate. But it could also snap the crew free of the anomaly influence. A very high-stakes gamble indeed. Keep developing the simulation model, Harris told Chen. We'll revisit if Beth's generator plan doesn't work. The scientist nodded and returned to the calculations. Even stranded in decaying orbit, they were still fighting. Harris took strength from that. The human spirit endured whatever obstacles the universe threw their way. In the Medi Bay, Akiko helped Felipe and Elena tend to the afflicted crew. The symptoms had graduated to cell degeneration, manifesting as degraded tissue, nerve dysfunction, and cognitive impairment. Once vibrant, strong bodies were failing. As Akiko carefully fed patients no longer able to lift utensils to their own mouths, she contemplated the cruel irony. Just as they neared the dream of a new home, their bodies began to betray them. Felipe and Elena monitored failing organs and administered stimulants to eke out a little more function. But the decay seemed to accelerate the more they treated it. Elena bowed her head over a crewman close to the end. There was only so much they could do now to hold back the tide. In any war against mortality, death still won eventually. In the hydroponics bay, Miguel examined the withering plants for signs of improvement after Beth adjusted the gravity generators. But it was no use. Leaves continued to brown and peel away in clumps. The crops were dying, their main food source vanishing. Miguel clutched the edges of a planter box, willing some small herb to regain its color and stand tall. You can do this, little one, he urged it. We just have to outlast this evil somehow. But its leaves only curled tighter, beyond hope. No clear path forward seemed left to them. But when Miguel's clouded vision cleared, Harris' voice echoed over the ship comms with amplified clarity. "We cannot and will not surrender, no matter how hopeless and alone we feel," the captain proclaimed firmly. "Others gave their lives, knowing we would find the strength within ourselves to continue their legacy. We will navigate our way through this, if we face it united as one people, resolved to the last." Miguel gently touched a shriveled leaf. "You hear that? We're still fighting," he whispered. "Maybe words alone could not restore life, but they rekindled weary hearts when all else faded." Out of darkness, hope took fragile root again. Chapter 8. Captain Harris stood behind Chen on the bridge, watching tensely as the scientist monitored Beth's progress adjusting the gravity generators. According to Chen's carefully constructed projections, reshaping their local gravity field could disrupt the anomaly's grip on the ship just long enough to correct their decaying orbit. A delicate treatment for a potentially terminal condition. "How's it looking?" Harris pressed impatiently. They were down to a timeline of hours at best before systems began an irrecoverable downward spiral. "The generators are responding," Chen reported. "Output waveform is stabilizing to our specifications." Harris studied the weakening power curves on the display as Beth coaxed every bit of juice she could from the faltering generators. Either this worked, or the next step was taking the ship apart from the outside in. A proximity warning flashed. Harris snapped around to see a roiling atmospheric disturbance looming in their path. "Evasive now." Chen redirected emergency power to the maneuvering thrusters. The drain on their reserves was instant and massive. "We lack sufficient thrust to avoid it," he warned tersely. All Harris could do was brace himself as they plunged into the maelstrom. Turbulence shook the ship violently. He winced at the sound of shearing metal and overstressed joints. They could not take much more abuse. As suddenly as it struck, they passed through the far boundary. "Damage report," Harris demanded. Chen shook his head as he took stock of the countless warnings screaming from his console. "That overloaded our remaining generators. We've lost primary and secondary systems across the ship." Harris absorbed this fatal blow. Without main power, little would function now. Their trajectory was locked in, all control lost. And the corrosive effect continued to eat away at every weakened system that remained. They were well and truly crippled, adrift toward the planet's heart. In the hydroponics bay, the jolt hurled Miguel against the wall. He lay there for a moment, the wind knocked out of him. Finally, he hauled himself to his feet, bracing against shooting pain. Miguel didn't need to check sensors to know their tenuous gravity field had collapsed. The plant's slow decay accelerated instantly. Leaves shriveled, stems collapsed, crops meant to sustain the colony withered before his eyes. Miguel swept an arm across the planters in helpless frustration. The seeds he had diligently nurtured were spent, their life sapped. Nothing would grow in this place now. In the Medi Bay, sparks erupted from malfunctioning equipment as Akiko and the doctors shielded vulnerable patients from harm. Life support monitors blinked out one by one. Felipe swallowed hard as he finished manually pumping air into the lungs of a crewman whose ventilation had cut off. There was no bringing him back, not anymore. A horrible thought gripped Akiko then. For all they knew, the descent systems could also be dead. "Do you think the ship will still be able to land safely?" she whispered. "I don't know," Ellen admitted, her expression grim. "But we'll stay with our patients either way. It's all we can do." In engineering, Beth desperately bypassed failed circuits to restore even minimal power. but it was hopeless. Every system was crashing in cascading failures until even auxiliary lighting cut off, plunging the deck into darkness. Beth closed her eyes against rising despair. She had promised the captain she could solve this, but she had failed completely. Now, huddled in terrified darkness, she could only listen helplessly as the ship fell into its death spiral all around her. On the derelict bridge, Harris sat beside Chen in the glow of emergency runners. Without navigation or propulsion, there was nothing left for them to do but ride out the ship's final descent. Chen slid a small data stick across to Harris. Past mission reports and logs, in case it survives. Harris nodded solemnly at the legacy entrusted to him. Let's go down to the observation deck. I'd rather see the sky than the ground. In wordless agreement, the two erstwhile allies left the useless bridge. As they made their way down, Harris touched his comm badge out of habit. All decks, this is the captain, he addressed the silent ship. It has been the greatest honor of my life to serve as your leader. No captain could ask for a finer crew. Signing off, Harris joined Chen in front of the large viewport on the observation deck. Together, they watched as the first faint curve of the horizon became visible through the clouds ahead. For better or worse, the end of their journey neared. Harris placed a steadying hand on Chen's shoulder. If these were their final moments, they would face them without fear. Chapter 9. A violent jolt shook Harris and Chen as the observation deck's viewport suddenly filled with solid blackness. The two men reached out to brace each other against falling. Had they hit some massive object, or even the planet's surface? But no, Harris observed with puzzlement. The darkness appeared to be a tangible field engulfing the ship's exterior. Analysis? Harris prompted Chen. The scientist was already scanning with a portable sensor unit. Some kind of stress-induced spatial distortion, he deduced. We appear to be inside an intangible anomaly bubble. Harris' eyes widened at a flash of realization. The gravitational disturbance, you said it could still be interacting with us. Is this a side effect? Plausible, Chen conceded, continuing to study the phenomenon. It may have spontaneously generated a protective region of space-time around the ship, just as we neared structural failure. Harris felt the tiniest spark of hope. Can we use this, get the engines back online? Chen pondered, then gave a decisive nod. The negation effect may buy enough time to counter the decay. We can attempt a system reboot. Harris clasped Chen's shoulder. That was all the prompting he needed to spring into action. Rally every able engineer to the reactor room on the double. I'll contact Beth and tell her to meet you there. We're going to restart this ship. Chen hurried off to gather resources for one last chance at revival. Harris touched his comm, fighting to contain emotion in his voice. Beth, can you hear me? Get to the reactor room now. We need a miracle. In the darkened engineering bay, Beth sat slumped against the wall, lost in despair. When Harris' voice crackled through, it took a moment to process before she stirred. The captain needed her. She forced leaden limbs to straighten, moving in the direction his voice had come. There was still some tiny flicker yet to fan. Harris continued broadcasting on all bands, calling the crew to action. I know you can feel the ship dying around you, but we can't die with it. Our ancestors crossed the void of space on faith and courage. Now we must find that same strength, get to your posts, and prepare for an emergency restart. Around the ship, scattered souls heard Harris' rallying call. In the Medi Bay, Akiko helped Felipe and Elena to their feet. Together they made their unsteady way toward the action, determined not to forsake duty. In the ruined hydroponics bay, Miguel clenched his fists as the captain's words resonated through his soul. Harris was right. Their people had endured too much to falter now. They would find some last reserve of will, because the alternative was to let hope perish. Miguel set off through dark corridors, heart racing with renewed purpose. Chen rapidly issued instructions as engineers crowded the reactor room. Beth rushed in last, meeting Chen's gaze. In wordless agreement, they began the battle to revive the inert cores before the anomaly field collapsed. Beth bypassed damaged circuits, coaxing flickers of life from dormant boards. Chen manually adjusted the antimatter mixture ratio, priming the reactor. Around them, the rest of the team reconnected structural supports and aligned damaged components. Now came the moment of truth. "On my mark," Chen called out. Beth nodded, hands poised above the master control panel. Harris' voice carried clearly down through the ship. "All decks, stand by for emergency restart. Initiate." At Chen's signal, Beth initiated the startup sequence. All power levels were at 0. This was a true cold boot of a dead system, a theory never tested. Static and darkness persisted for agonizing seconds. Then indicators blinked on. Current slowly amped in the coils. With a full-bodied thrum, the reactor finally came back online. Cheers went up from the assembled crew. Against impossible odds, they had reawakened the ship's slumbering heart. On the bridge, Harris listened and watched in exultation as board after board switched on. Chen's voice came through, exhausted but triumphant. "Captain, all primary systems are back online. The shadow field is continuing to nullify the decay effect." Harris allowed himself a deep sigh of relief. But their trials were not over yet. Now came the hard part, piloting this broken ship the rest of the way down. "Stand by to reclaim manual control on my order," he told Chen. Laying hands on the guidance controls, Harris steeled himself. Time to guide them home. Chapter 10. Captain Harris sat tensely at the navigation console as the observation deck's viewport remained obscured by the dark anomaly field enveloping the ship. Somewhere beyond, the surface of Terra Nova awaited. But without sensor data or visibility, attempting to land would be disastrous. They were flying blind. "Chen, what's our status getting sensors and external imaging back online?" he asked urgently. "Multiple faults are still preventing full restoration," the scientist replied in frustration. "We are attempting workarounds." Harris drummed his fingers, weighing options. An idea struck him. What if we deliberately collapse the field? It may reboot other systems. Collapse could also allow the decay effect to resume, Chen countered. Harris frowned, conceding the point. With the remaining margins so thin, any gambles had to be weighed carefully. "Keep trying to bypass the sensor faults and get creative. We need a solution fast." As Chen signed off to resume work, Harris leaned back in his seat. Escaping the anomaly's grip would require some brilliant improvisation now. Good thing ingenious insight was an old friend's forte. Sometime later, Chen's voice returned on the calm, clipped and uneasy. "Captain, I must urgently speak with you in person about our sensor recovery efforts." Harris' instincts tingled curiously at the vague request. "On my way." Down in the science lab, he found Chen alone, staring intently at a display of system diagnostics. Harris crossed to join him. Report. Chen drew a deep breath. I have identified a means to restore full sensor capability, but I cannot in good conscience recommend we implement it. Harris narrowed his eyes. Why the secrecy and sudden reticence? Explain. When Chen hesitated, Harris fixed him with his best no-nonsense stare. Tell me what this option is now. The scientist finally complied, avoiding Harris' gaze. The discharge of a controlled EM pulse could reset sensor boards, which otherwise resist repair. However, it may overload other vulnerable systems. Vulnerable systems like our atmospheric recycling plant? Harris guessed with sudden intuition. At Chen's grave nod, he gritted his teeth in frustration. Of course, the only solution had to also entail potentially snuffing out the air they breathed. You can increase shielding to minimize backflow damage, Harris countered. Only partly, Chen maintained. The risks outweigh any potential benefits. I must advise against this approach. Harris leaned forward intently. Right now I need our eyes restored more than I need you protecting me, Chen. We're flying blind, in case you've forgotten. When Chen stood firm, Harris finally slammed a fist down. Damn it, I'm still the captain here. Now ready the pulse, that's an order. Chen stiffened, seeming to wrestle internally with objections. But at last professional decorum overrode personal doubts. It will be done, he said simply, moving to carry out the command. As Chen exited, Harris dropped heavily into a seat, exhaling hard. He understood all too well the qualms staying Chen's customary clinical detachment. Their duties were frequently at odds, the scientist bound by ethics, the captain by necessity. But forced to choose, Harris could not jeopardize the entire mission to play it safe. Sometimes salvation carried terrible cost. Chen avoided his gaze during the short preparation, then straightened with reluctance. Pulse ready on your word. His eyes pleaded silently for reprieve, but Harris steeled himself. Now. Even through deck plating, the discharge thrummed palpably. Harris closed his eyes, praying he had not just doomed them all. But the deed was done now. They would live or die by its result. When Chen spoke again, his voice was hollow. Sensors have been restored, imaging systems coming back online. Then, after a pause, the fatal blow. Warning, catastrophic failure in atmospheric processing, oxygen depletion now imminent. Harris had gambled their most precious resource for this one victory. Chen's face clearly said he hoped it was worth the cost. Personally willing the sacrifice, Harris clapped his shoulder. Then we'd best not waste this chance. Let's find a place to land before we run out of air to breathe. Chapter 11. Captain Harris strode onto the bridge, bracing himself for the ominous readings to come. If Chen's projections were accurate, they now had only hours of remaining breathable atmosphere before CO2 overtook the ship. Time enough, hopefully, to set the ship down on the still obscured planet below. Navigation restored yet? He asked tersely. Miguel's descendant, manning the helm, shook his head. Positioning is still down. Guidance shows flatline. Harris exhaled hard through his nose. He had sacrificed their air and Chen's faith for this, yet they still could not find their way through the space anomaly shrouding their descent. They needed a navigator's ingenious touch now more than ever. Where is Beth? He demanded. Get her up here. Moments later, the young engineer arrived, looking to him expectantly. Harris motioned her over to the dead navigation console. Work your magic, We need our heading and a landing solution. As Beth ran through system diagnostics, Harris studied her expression. Yes, that same spark of intuitive problem-solving he had so relied on once lived in her too. She would find the answer. After long minutes of cerebral toil, Beth looked up brightly. Sensors are still scrambled externally, but I can extrapolate positional data using inertial traces from our descent maneuvers. Her nimble fingers danced across the controls, filtering noise and amplifying patterns too deeply buried for the system to detect. Harris watched tensely over her shoulder as phantom echoes and scattered reflections slowly resolved into a hazy topographical scan of the surface below. It was hardly precision guidance, but it would have to do. Beth flashed him a fierce grin. Rough vector to the landing site overlay. Want me to plot a course? Harris squeezed her shoulder with deep pride. Take us down. At the engineering station, Chen watched impassively as Beth's ingenious solution led them forward despite his own paralyzing doubts. Harris moved to join him. We're going to make it because of her, he said simply. Chen dipped his head in acquiescence. I lost sight of why our risks are necessary, but she sees clearly still. He met Harris' gaze. Forgive my lapse of judgment. Harris clasped the scientist's arm. Your caution stopped me charging ahead blindly too many times to count. We need each other's strengths to lead as one. Gratitude flickered in Chen's tired eyes. Together they had navigated countless perils on this journey. United once more, they would guide the rest home. On the agricultural deck, Miguel monitored oxygen levels sinking into the red zone. At current rates of decline, they would asphyxiate long before reaching terra firma. The air-filtering machinery his ancestor had cultivated was failing. Miguel desperately adjusted flow valves and purged blocked chemical scrubbers to eke out slightly more efficiency. But the full breakdown could not be reversed. Their one resource no human could live without was almost spent. Over the comm, Harris' solemn voice reached him. Continue your duties with courage. Our mission is not futile while we still draw breath. Miguel blinked back tears, overwhelmed by the reality they would likely all die gasping down here after enduring so much. But the captain was right. If these were to be their last moments, he could spend them in despair or purpose. Squaring his shoulders, Miguel continued mechanically tending the wheezing systems. Harris' words resonated through his mind, drowning out the CO2 warnings. Hope lived on if they refused to let it perish. In the Medi Bay, Akiko helped Felipe and Alana prepare remaining patients for the final descent. Some had to be sedated to avoid panic as oxygen ran short. She soothed their fears with calm mantras, easing distress even as her own lungs labored. Felipe met her eyes with shared understanding. The end they had always known might be coming awaited below. But after journeying so far together, they would face it without regret. On the bridge, alarms warned of their descent vector decaying once again. Harris and Chen exchanged a solemn look. Their fleeting way forward had closed. But Beth rallied herself at the navigation console, gazing at the planet image with determination. I can do this, she insisted firmly. Harris rested his hands over hers on the controls. Together, we all can. United by faith more than instrumentation, they turned the ship downward. Whatever awaited below, they would meet it as one crew. Chapter 12. Captain Harris sat tensely as the bridge crew brought them down through the atmosphere. Their navigation was still mostly guesswork, trajectory projections flickering wildly with each buffet of turbulence. But bit by bit, terra firma drew closer. A proximity warning suddenly blared. Harris snapped his head up to see a vast mountain chain looming directly ahead through the thinning atmospheric haze. "Pull up now," he barked. Miguel's descendant wrenched back on the controls. Engines screamed in protest and metal groaned as he desperately tried to check their momentum. But the decaying ship lacked the power and maneuverability to fully arrest its descent. "Brace for impact," Harris yelled. The bridge crew had just enough time to lock down their restraints before the ship violently grazed the mountain peaks. Shearing metal and shattering alloy added to the deafening din as they careened past the granite barriers. The avalanche of stone their wake unleashed pursued them down the far slope, nipping relentlessly at the wounded ship's heels. When the bone-jarring impacts finally ceased, Harris raised his head cautiously. "Damage report." The screens revealed widespread failures across multiple decks as the ship listed ominously. Breathable atmosphere was now virtually nil. By all measures, they were mortally stricken. Yet Chen still bent intently over his console, assessing their dire status with clinical focus. Harris managed a bitter smile. Trust the consummate scientist to analyze the crisis right up until the final curtain. He opened a calm channel, steeling his voice. "All decks, this is the captain. Make immediate preparations for emergency landing and evacuation. We are going down, one way or another." Closing the channel, Harris met Chen's sober gaze. The unspoken truth passed between them. Their voyage was ending in catastrophe, all their desperate work for nothing. Chen gave a small nod, which Harris returned. Without need for further words, they turned together to watch through the cracking viewport as the surface rose up to meet them. They had fulfilled their duty to the end. The rest was beyond their hands now. Down in the ruined hydroponics bay, Miguel clasped a final wilted plant, like a proxy for all their dying hopes. So much had been sacrificed to come this far, only to fail within sight of deliverance. It seemed a cruel culmination of their cursed voyage. Over the comm, Harris' voice reached him through the din of failing systems. "My friends, fate may deny us the end we work toward, but our journey and memories still matter. They will endure beyond us." Miguel bowed his head as a tear fell on the broken plant. The captain was right. Even from the ashes of their dreams, something yet lived. Each small hope was a seed to be carried forward. In the Medi Bay, frantic alarms on failing life support systems drowned out any comforting words Akiko could offer. Yet still she moved among those helpless against approaching darkness, easing their passage with soothing balms and tonics. To succor and console was all that remained. Felipe met her eyes briefly across the chaos. A lifetime of companionship passed between them in the wordless glance. Come what may, they would be there for the crew, faithful guides into the great unknown all souls someday faced. Their hands would steady faltering hearts at the end. In engineering, Beth fought to restore stabilizers as the ship shuddered violently around her. But it was no use. Too many systems were smashed beyond salvage. Their engines were finished, ruined by forces indifferent to all their cunning designs and labor. Through cracking boards, Harris' steady voice reached Beth once more. "We will soon share the fate of all explorers who exceed the limits of endurance, but none shall forget our audacity or bravery." Beth set her jaw and redoubled her efforts, even knowing the battle was lost. Her captain's words resonated. One last defiant stand for the intrepid souls who had dreamed so boldly before her. On the bridge, warning sirens blared deafeningly as the ground rose up with impossible speed. But through it all, Harris kept his eyes fixed ahead. Every screen showed their death now rushing to embrace them. But he would meet it upright, unflinching. A hand firmly clasped his own, Chen sharing solidarity to the literal end. The two weathered veterans had walked together through fire and void uncounted times. Now they would take these final steps side by side. The ship struck the earth with an explosive thunder that silenced all else. Harris was thrown hard against his restraints, nearly blacking out from the savage impact. For long moments, his ears rang too loudly to make sense of anything. Then muffled shouts and cries filtered through, spurring him to raise his pounding head. They had landed, by providence or luck, they yet lived. Harris rose unsteadily, bracing against his chair. Through the cracked view screen, light shone down over a gently rolling plain, their long-sought destination. However, worse for wear, the ship had delivered them there, even when all seemed lost. They still had a chance. Harris clasped Chen's shoulder as the scientist stood shakily beside him. Together, they surveyed the struggling but miraculously intact crew rallying themselves on the ravaged bridge. Harris raised his voice above the din. "Ready all escorts and supply packs, we make for the surface." There was no telling how long the wreck held together. But by whatever providence, they had been granted one last opportunity. Harris' eyes flashed with determination as he faced the planet their people had sacrificed everything to reach. The final trial awaited planetside. Failure was not an option. They would succeed or die trying. Chapter 13. Captain Harris stepped through the main airlock onto the surface of Terra Nova, blinking against brilliant warm sunlight. All around him, the remaining crew gradually emerged from the crippled ship that had borne them across the void, weary but victorious. After a generations-long odyssey chasing this distant dream, they had finally arrived. Harris surveyed the varied terrain, soaring mountain peaks not far to the west, giving way to gently rolling foothills which blended seamlessly into verdant grassland sweeping to the east. Alien, yes, but strangely familiar all the same. A world of limitless potential, their new home. Lieutenant Torres, leading the security detail, approached Harris with a smart salute. "No hostile life forms detected during initial recon. Sir, area is cleared to begin unloading operations." Harris returned the salute firmly. "Then let's get our supplies ashore. This planet isn't tamed yet." He moved among the crew as they began assembling shelters from the prefabricated kits hauled out of the wrecked ship. Watching them work, hope and pride swelled in Harris' chest. They had overcome every trial the void could conjure, persevered against unrelenting adversity, and now the future lay open before them, theirs to shape with their own hands. This empty land would bloom under their determined care. Chen sat nearby, consulting sensor readings from the planet's surface. Harris came over to join him. Analysis. Atmosphere is within acceptable tolerance ranges, Chen reported clinically. Background radiation slightly elevated, but still within habitable parameters. No major quakes or weather events imminent. He finally set down the scanner to take in their surroundings with naked eyes. By all measures, conditions are optimal. The admission seemed to startle even Chen with its improbability. Harris grinned and clapped his old friend's back. "After everything we endured, I'll take an optimal outcome. This planet was determined to kill us on the way down, yet we're all still standing." For the moment, Chen amended with characteristic caution. Long-term survival is still contingent on many factors. But not even Chen's ingrained skepticism could diminish the sense of victory today. They had reached the promised land, fate be damned. The rest they would face in its time. Night fell with startling swiftness, the dwarf sun dipping below the craggy horizon. Harris made his inspection rounds in the makeshift camp, checking on the progress and condition of his exhausted crew. Morale was fragile, but holding steady. Hardship and loss could not be erased overnight, but bit by bit people were remembering there was room for laughter beneath the stars. They would mend. In the medical tent, he found Akiko talking softly with two young ensigns prone on cots, their limbs swathed in protective casts. Whatever she was telling them, their pained expressions had softened as they listened. Even at the brink of oblivion, her gentle counsel had soothed lost souls. Here, she was nurturing hope again through the power of her words. When Akiko noticed Harris, she quickly excused herself to speak with him. The ensigns sustained multiple fractures during the landing, but your decision to evacuate bought them time. She smiled faintly. Once again, your leadership spared lives. Harris studied her weary, but ever-serene face. And your wisdom and care kept spirits aloft when all seemed lost. We owe you much, Akiko. They clasped hands briefly in mutual gratitude. However daunting the path ahead, they would walk it together. Crossing the encampment, Harris found Beth fine-tuning a portable generator by starlight. He had to chuckle. You know the equipment isn't going anywhere, get some rest. The young engineer sat back reluctantly, rubbing bleary eyes. I'll sleep better knowing our systems won't crash. Her dedication was as strong as her skills. She would be critical to managing the technology the colony relied on. Harris helped her to her feet. Trust me, it will keep for a few hours. I need your mind sharp. As she reluctantly agreed, Harris felt the full weight of responsibility on his shoulders. Leaders could chart the course, but it was people like Beth who embodied the perseverance and audacity that made it possible. The future would test them all greatly. Alone in his shelter, Harris sank onto his cot and dropped his head in his hands. Every muscle ached from deferred pains held at bay by necessity and indomitable will. They had won their foothold here today, but the true trial began on the morrow. Building a colony would require everything he had to give and more. Could he summon the strength time and again? Looking up, Harris gazed out the fluttering door at the strange new world that lay open to them. Somewhere beneath those unfamiliar constellations, their destiny awaited. Whatever it required of him, he would give his all to guide his people toward it. After this long night, a new dawn was coming. But the light would shine for them all if they kept faith. With that lone conviction stealing his mind, Harris let exhausted eyes finally close. Darkness still lurked, but hope remained alive. And with hope, no obstacle or setback could stop them for long. Chapter 14. Captain Harris studied the terrain maps laid out before him. After days surveying their surroundings, the planet's challenges and threats were coming into focus. Selecting a permanent settlement site would require balancing many geographical and tactical factors. This ridge provides ample granite and iron ore deposits, Lieutenant Torres advised, indicating a rugged spur of hills. We could mine what we need to expand operations. Harris nodded, but frowned at the exposed position and steep cliffs ringing the elevated site. It lacks defensible ground. Any attack could decimate an isolated camp up there. He shifted focus to a broad open plain farther south. This grassland offers space for agriculture and livestock, and visibility is good in all directions. Torres looked dubious. But also little shelter if storms sweep in from the sea, and we'd have to venture far abroad for other critical resources. Neither option was ideal, Harris acknowledged frustratedly. This world seemed determined to thwart them at every turn. He glanced to the other department heads gathered around the maps, inviting fresh perspectives. Perhaps a compromise between the two locales, Akiko suggested diplomatically. We may find a suitable valley within reach of both hills and fields. Miguel's descendant nodded agreement, tracing the snaking contours between mountain foothills and lowland plains. If we follow one of these rivers, it could lead to a sheltered site with access to the resources we need. Harris stroked his chin thoughtfully as he visualized the proposed route. It showed promise, a haven between extremes, positioned to tap what they must from this still foreign landscape. Chart an expedition to scout the river course, he directed Torres. Report back on any viable sites for a permanent settlement. The rest of you, continue preparations to depart this camp. The team dispersed to their tasks with purpose. After so much loss, a clear path forward was emerging again from the ashes. Step by step, they were learning to read the secrets in this world around them. Given time, they would unlock all it had to offer and plant their roots deep. Alone again, Harris let his steady mask fall away. The brief flash of optimism dwindled back to embers as he tallied all that still threatened their fragile enterprise. Dwindling supplies, damaged technology barely nursing along, killer storms sweeping down from the mountains, and the countless perils of an untamed planet waiting to pick off the unwary. How long could they hold against that unrelenting assault? The sound of footsteps drew Harris from his brooding. He looked up to see Chen studying him pensively. As so often before, the scientist seemed to read his inner turmoil with a glance. You are troubled. Harris waved a hand over the maps. The equation doesn't balance. We've already lost too much, and what this planet demands? He trailed off heavily. Chen stepped closer, lowering his voice. When I ran the projections those first years into the voyage, I calculated our odds of success as less than 1%, and yet we persist. His steady gaze held Harris. What we attempt here remains unlikely, but probability does not account for the human spirit that belongs to us alone. Chen punctuated this rare philosophical musing by gripping Harris' shoulder. Trust in them, as you always have. The numbers tell only part of our story. Harris slowly exhaled, letting the wisdom take root. However long the odds, they had already overcome so much that should have destroyed them. As Chen reminded him, the map showed only surface features, not the shared heart and hope beating beneath. And those had carried them through peril before. Harris straightened, resolve restored. You're right, old friend. Keep scanning ahead, but don't forget to look at what we're made of too. He extended a hand which Chen firmly clasped. What the coming days required, they would find within themselves. And together, they would make a home. 2 weeks later, Lieutenant Torres' survey team returned with hopeful news. They had located a sheltered valley, several days' journey south at a converging of rivers. It offered space for cultivation and pasture, with hillsides rich in ore and timber. Consensus quickly emerged among the crew they had their haven. Preparations began immediately for the trek to their new home site. Under Harris' direction, the camp was dismantled and loaded onto rugged ground vehicles cobbled together from salvaged ship parts. After one last night on the exposed plain, they were ready to depart on the final leg toward their destiny. The convoy rolled out at first light. Harris rode in the lead rover, watching the varied terrain gradually sweep past. He glanced back often to ensure the rest still followed close behind. Bit by bit over the hours, the land changed from sparse grassland to gentle foothills thick with vegetation. Renewed hope swelled in Harris at this glimpse of the valley's bounty to come. But suddenly, from high overhead, came an ear-splitting screech unlike any creature heard before. Harris craned his neck to glimpse a flock of leathery winged beasts diving toward them. His thoughts flashed back to the perilous descent, when every unknown was a mortal threat. Had their next trial found them at last? As the beasts wheeled closer, he saw riders astride, each one holding spear-like weapons. This planet was inhabited after all. Harris raised his protective visor and stood in full view, hand raised in hope of peaceful contact. But the foremost rider took aim directly at him. There was no time to react, as the electrified spear shot forward. But Chen threw himself in its path, the bowl piercing his chest before he crumpled without a sound. Harris cried out in anguish at his fallen friend. The battle for their world had turned hot at last. Now the true fight for survival began. Chapter 15. Hit down now, Harris yelled to the convoy. Crew threw themselves flat in the rovers, or scrambled for what cover the terrain offered as another volley of spears rained down around them. The alien riders bent and came around for another pass, howling shrieks as they dove. Lieutenant Torres rose up from the second rover, aiming her assault rifle on the lead attacker. She dropped it with a sustained burst of fire, sending its limp body tumbling. But the other riders evaded her follow-up shots with alarming agility and speed. Aim for the wings, Harris ordered. If they could cripple the beast's ability to stay aloft, it would blunt the dive attacks. He grabbed his own rifle and added suppressive fire to assist Taurus. Together they clipped several more beasts' wings, sending them spiraling heavily down to the plains. But still the assault continued unrelentingly. Ferocious return fire soon forced Taurus and Harris back into cover. They were pinned down, unable to move forward or turn back. And no telling when those spears might punch through to living targets. Harris kept low in the rover footwell, mind racing for options. But nothing presented itself. They lacked any tactical advantage out in the open like this. If it came down to attrition, the crew would lose against these relentless attackers. He slammed a fist against the floor in frustration. They had not survived the void only to be slaughtered helpless on the very doorstep of their new home. There had to be a way. The loud screech of a wounded beast refocused him. That was it. The enemy's air cover gave them mobility, but also vulnerability. If he could ground just the right one in terrain they could reach, the rider could be neutralized. Harris formulated a risky gambit, then signaled Taurus. On my mark, concentrate fire on that brute at 11 o'clock. I'm going for the rider. Before she could argue, he bolted from the rover, zigzagging toward a sheltered gully. Alien spears peppered the ground at his heels, but by miracle none found their mark. As the injured beast circled lower still, Harris reached the gully and hit the dirt. Now, Lieutenant, light it up. Torres rose up and unloaded on the creature as it passed again. Fresh wounds finally sent it crashing down just paces from Harris, its piercing wails cutting the air. He was already rushing forward as the dazed rider tried to free itself from the harness. But Harris tackled the creature and drove his knife up under its chin before it could bring any concealed arms to bear. Dark, violet blood spurted hot over his gloves before the convulsing body went limp. Harris staggered clear, chest heaving with adrenaline. That was one threat neutralized. Now they had to end this assault. He was halfway back to the convoy when warning cries alerted him. Harris spun to see one last rider bearing down on him, wicked blade glinting in its hand. He raised his rifle, but the speed was too great. He had only seconds before it ran him down. A blur from the side collided with the rider in midair, sending them both tumbling heavily. Miguel's descendant rose unsteadily from the tangle, drawing a pistol from his belt. Before the fallen rider could react, 2 shots thundered into its chest cavity, finally stilling its frantic struggle. Harris clasped the brave man's shoulder tightly. Together they turned to face the remaining alien pack, raised weapons side by side. Around them, the rest of the crew rallied with fierce shouts, primed to repel all attackers. But the winged horde suddenly drew back, their coordinated assault disintegrating. More bodies and wrecked beasts littered the bloody ground than flew overhead now. Their losses must have finally outweighed their zeal for continued battle. With echoing shrieks, the creatures began retreating in a swirling vortex toward the distant mountains. Harris kept his rifle aimed at their withdrawing forms, wary of any renewed attack. But the aliens did not turn back. Their defeat today would not be the last they saw of this threat, he was certain. But for now, the crew was safe. As the last of the creatures dwindled from view, raucous cheers went up. They had driven off an unknown enemy and saved themselves from annihilation. After years struggling just to survive out here alone in the void, for once their audacity was rewarded. It was a hard-fought victory to kindle their pride anew. But the celebration was short-lived as urgency resurfaced. No time for complacence yet. Harris organized damage assessment and a rapid inventory. Miraculously, no crew were lost in the attack, though more than a few sported graze wounds and contusions. 2 rovers were damaged but salvageable. Their expedition could proceed. There was no question of turning back now. The way forward might be bloodier than anticipated, but it was also their sole hope of survival. They had to reach the valley settlement and build stronghold defenses before the aliens regrouped. This new world would be taken from them only when every last human lay dead. Harris finally turned to where Chen still lay motionless, blood pooling beneath him. Sorrow lanced through him at the sight. One sacrifice yet amongst their number in this brutal clash. Harris knelt and carefully closed the scientist's vacant eyes. "Your courage brought us to this world. We will make it our own, my friend, I swear it," he murmured. A brief farewell would have to suffice for now. But they would honor Chen's memory in the refuge they built here, forging the future with his ethic of bold discovery to guide them. The convoy was soon underway again, weary but undaunted. Harris kept scanning the skies and ridgelines for signs of renewed attack. But for now at least, their way remained clear. The valley beckoned ahead. After 2 more days weaving through rugged hills, they rounded the final bend and the settlement site came into view. A sheltered pocket of land awaited at the converging of rivers, the soil rich and terrain defendable. Home. Harris' chest swelled at the sight. Here, they could dare to dream again. In the fevered days that followed, the crew labored dawn to dusk to raise shelter and defenses before full darkness fell. Torres positioned gunnery emplacements on the surrounding heights and patrolled the perimeter ceaselessly. Miguel's descendant tilled soil to plant emergency crops. Beth and her apprentices integrated what power sources they had to electrify key points. Everyone who could swing a hammer or shovel contributed muscle and sweat. By the seventh night, their basic fortifications were in place. Exhausted but satisfied, Harris made his rounds to share words of praise and gratitude. Though shadows yet hung over them, seeing the fruits of long strife cheered every soul. They would endure and build, and one day soon look up at this alien sky with true belonging. From the command post, Harris watched the crews finally surrender to much-needed rest as cook fires died down. But he remained vigilant a while longer, listening to the night sounds that were no longer strange. However long the struggle ahead, this vista renewed his faith their resilience would conquer all. They would make a home in this untamed land or die trying. Chapter 16. Captain Harris crouched low atop the perimeter palisade, peering west toward the mountain range the alien attackers had emerged from. Days had passed since the ambush on the convoy, with no renewed assault. But he knew better than to let the quiet lull them into complacency. The next confrontation was surely just a matter of time. Down below in the secured settlement, the crew continued feverishly constructing shelters and support structures. Even the most vulnerable cargo had now been offloaded from the wrecked colony ship and transported here. Escape pods were being cannibalized into makeshift command and medical centers. They worked from dawn until after dusk, driven by the knowledge their window to prepare could slam shut without warning. Harris was pulled from his vigilant watch by footsteps on the ladder. Lieutenant Torres climbed up to report. The last sections are nearly reinforced and mine. We're down to final weapon emplacements around the East Gorge. Harris nodded approval. Then let's get them in place. No angle could be left vulnerable. As they descended to the perimeter, Harris rallied scattered security teams to assist with installing the automated guns in fortified bunkers along the gorge ridge. Even these colonial Marines looked haggard from the relentless workload, but spirits remained determined. The defense took shape steadily through their tireless labor. By nightfall, the settlement was as secured as cunning hands could make it. Harris rotated off the bone-weary crews to grab what rest they could before resuming their labors come morning light. But sleep eluded him for long hours as he ran through endless mental scenarios of how and when the aliens might strike again. They had seen only a glimpse of what flying horrors this world could unleash. More were certainly coming. Harris was still reviewing contingency plans when the perimeter alarms suddenly blared. He burst from his cot grabbing for his rifle as frantic voices reported movement on the north front. This was no drill. Their nightmare had returned. Racing to the palisade wall, Harris peered into spotlights, stabbing the darkness. Hundreds of darting shapes swarmed beyond the perimeter, smaller than the winged beasts, but far greater in number. He glimpsed segmented carapaces covering lithe, multi-limbed forms before the alien wave charged from the shadows in eerie silence. Hold until they're in range, Harris yelled. At his signal, automated turrets opened up with thunderous booms, joined by streaking crossfire from the bunkers. Dozens of creatures dropped in the withering barrage, but still they kept coming, leaping nimbly over their fallen kin. As the perimeter guards added their own strafing volleys, the aliens finally returned fire. Spears arced through the night, punches of plasma and lightning raining down on the defenses from unknown weapons. Harris kept firing steadily, even as strikes exploded against the barricade around him. They had to hold here, or the camp was doomed. For long, frantic minutes, the troops poured fire into the onrushing horde. Grimly, they sacrificed ground and ammunition, yielding no further to the endless assault than they must. But despite mounting enemy bodies, still more emerged from the shadows, exploiting every gap that opened. Finally, the awful numbers overwhelmed the defenders. With chilling shrieks, the aliens breached the perimeter at multiple points and flowed into the settlement like a deadly tide. "Fall back to the command bunker," Harris ordered the squads near him. "We have to." A searing impact cut him off as a plasma bolt exploded the palisade section in front of him. Harris flew through the flaming debris, hitting the ground hard enough to knock the wind from his lungs. Ringing ears drowned out the chaos as alien clawed feet scrambled past just paces away. Harris tried to rise, to rally any crew who could still fight on. But his shattered body betrayed him. He could only groan helplessly as the relentless horde overran their fledgling sanctuary and slaughtered any left in their path. This world had repelled humanity's incursion after all. They had gambled everything on the dream of a new beginning only to perish in fire and blood. It was over. From the darkness as his vision failed, strong hands grasped Harris, dragging him clear of the battle's center. His scattered senses could just recognize Akiko's voice as she called urgently for help. Harris tried to tell her to save herself and abandon this lost cause. But she clung to him even as alien shrieks drew nearer. "Not like this," Akiko insisted, her normally calm voice strained with emotion. "We've sacrificed too much." Her words echoed oddly through Harris' fading consciousness, kindling a memory from their darkest hours aboard ship, Chen reminding him how human spirit could overcome any odds. He still had a flicker of that resilient fire left. This could not be the end. With a monumental effort, Harris shook off the creeping oblivion and forced his legs beneath him. Akiko braced him as alien hordes pressed closer through the burning camp. Nowhere left to go but into the jaws of death. Harris raised a ragged cheer and drew his blade, determined to face the end on his feet and fighting. Akiko lifted her own knife beside him, refusing to falter with her captain. More ragged voices took up the defiant shout until it carried over the cacophony of combat. As the crew's valor reignited, chaos gripped the milling aliens. The unbroken resistance confounded them after the slaughter. Now their superior numbers counted for nothing in the narrow alleys between burning shelters. Harris strode forward undaunted even as deadly plasma seared past him. Beside Akiko and staggering refugees, he cut down the first creature to block their escape. Step by defiant step, the remnant crew began to carve a path toward safety in the night beyond. They would find it together, or leave this world with fists raised against the coming darkness. There was still light to be found if they chose to defy despair. Chapter 17. The ragtag remnants of the colony convoy staggered up the winding mountain pass, exhaustion and despair nipping at their heels. Only the pace set by Captain Harris kept them all from collapsing outright. Leading from the front, he urged them onward and upward, away from the burning ruins now far below. Behind them, funeral pyres lit the pre-dawn gloom over their fledgling settlement. All they had sweated and bled to build consumed in one savage night. There could be no burial honors for the many comrades who had fallen there. The only memorial left was escape, if any yet lived to one day return. As the cruel climb crested the final ridge, Harris called a wary halt, bracing his laid scouts to watch for pursuit through the rocky terrain. But the distant valley remained ominously still as false dawn slowly permeated the ashen sky. The night's horrors were past for now. They appeared to have bought some temporary reprieve. Harris lowered himself wearily against a boulder, feeling the full weight of every loss and sacrifice suddenly crash upon him. So much had been given to reach this new world, yet they had nothing left to show for it now but a graveyard and another scar upon their ragged souls. However far they fled into the wilderness, he knew their hopes of survival grew fainter by the hour. Around Harris, the hollow-eyed crew collapsed where they stood, too numb with defeat for words. No exultation or camaraderie remained, just a bone-deep exhaustion and despair they had nowhere left to escape or evade. He was overcome by the terrible futility of it all. They were a broken people, waiting only on the mercy of a merciless planet. Akiko moved silently among the refugees, tending injuries and offering what comfort frightened minds would accept. But even the stalwart counselor appeared shaken, her practiced aura of calm fractured. The night's horrors had overwhelmed them all. Harris searched his own barren spirit for some snippet of hope or words of encouragement to rally his people before the abyss claimed them. But only void answered. He could not convince them to keep struggling when every brief triumph here seemed destined to end in greater calamity. There was no lifeline left to offer their sinking hearts. When Akiko came to Harris, her eyes shone with the unspoken plea for him to rouse their spirits once more. But Harris could not summon the will to try. He mutely shook his head, the admission paining them both. Even he had no defiance or pride left, just resignation. Fate had finally crushed them all. At last he raised his weary eyes to scan the ragtag assembly now looking silently to him again. He forced unsteady legs to stand tall before them just once more, letting his raw words come straight from the heart. "You did everything honor demanded, and more," Harris spoke hoarsely. "No crew ever strived harder or endured more than you. Safeguard those who can now. Our journey ends, but yours need not." With this absolution given, Harris descended again into his hollow despair. He had released them from duty's cruel bonds. Their course was no longer his to direct or determine. However these last days played out, the cold stars would bear witness they had given their all in pursuit of an unreachable dream. Captain and crew now faded as one. Slowly, the refugees began turning away from Harris' defeated form toward the mountain wilds rising above them. Families gathered their remaining children close and collected what scant supplies had been saved from the flight. Crewmates leaned one another as they hobbled doggedly up the winding slopes. Wary eyes scanned for threats, but otherwise hollow stares remained locked on each labored step in turn. No one glanced back, for there was nothing left to see but the grave markers of their failure. Akiko paused only to drape an emergency blanket over Harris's slumped shoulders before she too joined the grim exodus. He barely reacted as the last fellow refugee disappeared up the far pass. At long last, he was left alone here to await the inevitable. A fitting end to be the final casualty in their hopeless crusade. A captain forever married to his ship. As the sun crested distant peaks to wash the ravaged valley in light anew, Harris finally let exhaustion overtake him. With no one left depending on his facade of courage, he surrendered to darkness relief at last. Duty could demand no more of him now. He was just a shell void of purpose or spirit. But as consciousness ebbed, Harris glimpsed a final vision of the green land below, stretching to the brightening horizon. The promise it symbolized yet to be fulfilled. Their last day had not yet dawned, if someone took up the banner from his fallen hand. That sparkling hope shone steady through the gloom, waiting to be kindled anew when the time was right. But its light faded to nothingness as Harris' eyes drifted closed, indifferent to what the coming days might bring. The mission was over. Chapter 18. The crackle of a small fire finally stirred Harris from his restless stupor. He rose unsteadily, blinking against darkness. How long had he been adrift? A concerned voice whispered urgently nearby, but incomprehensible in his fogged state. As Harris' eyes adjusted, a familiar weathered face hovering over him came into focus. "Captain, can you hear me?" Miguel's descendant asked worriedly. Harris managed a weak nod. "Miguel, what are you? The others, did they escape?" Miguel spared a quick glance into the night before turning back. "I think so, though their path is hidden from me now." He put a bracing hand on Harris' shoulder. "When you did not follow, I feared you were still lost in darkness, but I could not go on and leave you behind." Harris studied him in confusion. After absolving them all and abandoning hope himself, why would anyone still stand by his side? But Miguel's steadfast loyalty was apparent as he held out a small ration of food and waited patiently for Harris to take it. However inexplicable, he had not been left to perish alone after all. As Miguel fed the meager fire, Harris sensed his thoughts drifting back through their struggles here, the horizons they had crossed, enemies overcome, and unbearable prices paid. Miguel had endured the same bitter losses, yet still nursed some inner light against the gathering dark. Harris saw it flicker behind the man's eyes each time the blaze rose higher. Somehow, despite every calamity, hope yet lingered here when he was certain all had been extinguished. Miguel glanced up from the flames to meet Harris' gaze. "I understand, Captain. Part of me wanted to lay down and surrender to fate as well back there. But my ancestor Maria's spirit sustains me still. Her dream lives on." Harris turned this revelation over silently. Maria's mission had been to cultivate life. Was that flowering vision truly not dead? As Miguel tended the fragile fire, Harris recalled how he had sheltered dying seedlings back on the ship when all seemed lost already. Somewhere in this man, a spark yet endured. "What we built lies in ashes," Harris said heavily, testing him. "The crew clings to false hope, fleeing into wilderness. Our cause is long lost." But Miguel did not falter. Transient setbacks only, life always finds a way through the burned forest to green again, but it needs patient gardeners to nurture the miracle. His eyes met Harris intently across the flames. "We cannot force the seeds to grow on our timetable, but if we attend them faithfully, forests rise in their time." Harris held that stalwart gaze, feeling the first cracks forming in his shell of resignation. Miguel was right. The things they had planted here would not be reaped overnight, or even in their lifetime. But that did not make them dead or the hope futile. Even if he could not see it himself yet, life could still emerge from these bitter ashes if given a chance. Harris slowly straightened against the stone bracing him. If men like Miguel yet retained such faith, how could he surrender to despair? The crew needed steadfast voices to coax forth the green shoots, not more foster the creeping darkness. And Harris knew now the voice they expected to hear over the silent void, calling them back from oblivion's edge. The choice confronting him was clear at last. Harris clasped Miguel's arm firmly, seeing his own reignited flicker mirrored back at him. "Then we shall make this land our garden," he declared, rising. Miguel grinned broadly at the familiar, indomitable tone in his captain's voice again. As long as Harris led them, no defeat was permanent or cause surrendered. Together, they would help life rise from the ashes. Harris kicked dirt over the fire's embers as Miguel hastily gathered their scarce supplies. Wordless understanding passed between them. It was time to rejoin the others before the wilderness swallowed them whole and hope was snuffed out forever. Officers could not lead from the rear or guide the lost from distant peaks. As Harris strode toward the winding mountain pass, senses reawakened to danger and duty, Miguel fell in beside him. Step for step they climbed toward whatever awaited above. Twin shadows melded seamlessly into one on the rock wall behind them. However steep the next slope, together they would crest it and carry the crew with them. Captain and Guardian parted no more. Chapter 19. Captain Harris crested the ridge and scanned the rolling country below through his rifle scope. No movement, no signs of life at all in the brooding expanse. Wherever the crew had fled after the massacre, they were either holed up in concealment, captured, or... Harris refused to indulge that grim thought until he laid eyes on remains himself. Until then, optimism demanded believing his people yet survived out there. It was his duty now to find and rally them before alien horrors or the elements picked them off alone. Harris glanced to Miguel, maintaining watch behind him. No tracking where they descended. The Guardian shook his head in frustration. The trail is obscured, but they would seek shelter and sustenance first. He pointed toward a distant woodland cradled between the hills. If any escaped the valley, they may have taken refuge there. Harris studied the terrain, weighing options. With no bearings but instinct and faith, it was their only logical recourse. And we start searching there. The two men descended cautiously into the valley, senses primed for any sign of life or threat. But only arid winds met them on the barren ground. Their isolation felt more acute with each mile across the lifeless wasteland. Even the sun overhead seemed to glare balefully, wilting hope's first tender shoots. When the bone-weary pair finally stumbled from the sea of shrubs onto the wooded ridge, Harris almost wept for joy at the sight of flowing water and shade. Somewhere nearby, the others could be resting and rebuilding strength they would need to carry on this fight. With renewed urgency, they began combing the woodland, calling out on the slim chance voices might answer. But again, no response reached their ears except the alien rustle of leaves and creak of swaying boughs. The forest stood oblivious or indifferent to their desperate search. Just as frustration threatened to curdle into despair once more, Miguel grabbed Harris' sleeve. "Look, Captain." He pointed excitedly to a small clearing of trampled undergrowth. Scattered ashes remained from a crude fire pit. Harris' pulse quickened. Muted signs of human passage were evident if one knew how to read them. His people had sheltered here for a time. "Fan out and search for more evidence," he told Miguel. With tempered excitement, they began tracing the subtle trail markers, a frayed length of torn cloth, discarded food wrappers missed in their flight, faint boot prints in muddy banks shielded from the wind. Piece by piece, a path forward emerged from the tangle. The meandering signs led deep into the forest, toward higher, more defensible ground. Whoever was covering the crew's retreat had skillfully masked it from easy view. But they could only hide so well from a trained eye that knew where to look. Harris was now certain the colonists had found temporary haven somewhere up ahead. Rounding a dense thicket, he suddenly halted, holding up a closed fist. Miguel froze instantly, eyes following Harris' rigid gaze toward a depression sheltered by protruding rocks. Camouflaged in its depths was the entrance to an underground complex, an emergency bolt hole for colony support staff in case of environmental threat. Someone among the escaped crew knew this protocol. Harris kept Miguel back, signaling for caution as he stealthily approached the bunker door. There was no telling yet if friend or foe awaited within. He listened intently for any sound of occupation. Satisfied it was not an ambush, Harris pounded the metal hatch with his rifle stock while calling out, "You in there? This is the captain. What's your situation?" For agonizing seconds, only silence answered. Then came the grind of locks disengaging before the door creaked open a few inches. Harris glimpsed Lieutenant Torres' wary face peering out before she yanked him inside, slamming the portal shut. As Harris' eyes adjusted to dim emergency lighting, he took quick stock of the cramped shelter. A dozen or so shocked but overjoyed faces stared back at him from makeshift bedding. Perhaps 40 souls in all had made it this far, hollow-eyed and weary but blessedly alive. Akiko rose shakily from beside her row of patients to embrace him and Miguel. "We thought you lost like so many others," she said thickly. "Thank Providence you found us." Harris clasped her hands, overcome with relief himself. However tenuous and fraught with danger ahead, their people yet endured. While even one colonist drew breath, hope survived. As the refugees eagerly gathered around him, Harris knew this battered remnant would need more than another speech now to rouse their spirits. They required food, shelter, medicine, and tangible life supports, not mere words. He turned urgently to Torres. "Report, what are our resources, the condition of the crew?" She stiffened to bleak attention. Minimal supplies remain, some wounds are infected, malnutrition is widespread, and morale is shattered. Her face hardened. "We are fading, sir." Harris nodded firmly, letting the stark assessment steel his resolve. "Then we have our objectives: secure more sustainable shelter, replenish supplies, and raise morale." He clasped Miguel's shoulder. "We will split up to achieve them all in parallel, and once the crew is made whole again, we will take back what was stolen from us." Around Harris, backs straightened and chins lifted. His uncompromising confidence was the lifeline they clutched to pull themselves from despair's pit. While he stood firm, they would too rise again. Turning to Lieutenant Torres, Harris issued crisp orders to organize food-gathering patrols and bolster their defenses here. Then he dispatched Miguel to bring Akiko and the doctors to any wounded unable to make the retreat. Each volunteered man and woman accepted their duty with passionate shouts to coalesce again into a true colony. Their common purpose was renewed. Fierce energy and audacity returned in answer to Harris' rallying call. However steep the ascent ahead, takes and tribulations only honed the human spirit. They did not break it. Shoulder to shoulder once more, the crew turned to meet the coming trials. This world did not know their full strength yet. Chapter 20. Captain Harris peered through his binoculars toward the burned-out remnants of the settlement in the valley below. It had taken 3 hard weeks as fugitives hiding in the mountain wilderness, but finally his crew was strong and organized enough to contemplate reprisal. The hour of fateful decision had come at last. Beside Harris on the ridge, Lieutenant Torres kept watch over the strike team assembled below. "Just give the order, sir, and we'll rain hell down on them for what they did." Her glare smoldered with vengeful fury. Harris lowered his binoculars thoughtfully. The offer tempted to repay cruelty and devastation in kind now that the odds were reversed. Complete annihilation of the aliens would indeed prevent further attacks. But was more death and ruin truly their sole recourse? To become so hardened risked losing their own humanity here in the void. Perhaps there was still a path back from the abyss, if he dared extend faith where none likely was warranted. A wild-card gamble, but one his conscience urged him to consider. Harris turned to Torres. "Have our best linguists join me below, and get the advanced scout team geared up." At her look of surprise, he managed a grim smile. "Time we tried communicating rather than killing." As Harris descended the ridge, he could not deny the risk he took, attempting contact when combat had only escalated violence between them. But the ethical choice was not always the pragmatic one. If there was the slightest chance to avoid more bloodshed, his conscience would not rest unless he made the overture. The linguists listened intently as Harris explained the plan. Approach openly under a flag of truce, then relay their appeal through translators once in range. After long debate, the universal concepts of cooperation and coexistence were rendered as best they could from first principles. The crude vocabulary would have to suffice. When the team was ready, Harris led them in plain view down the ridge toward the settlement. He kept his posture and hands extended and open to demonstrate their non-hostile intent. The scout trio maintained a lookout for any alien patrols. But the valley remained eerily empty right up to the barricades erected that final night. Harris passed silently through the breached gates into a frozen tomb where every pockmarked wall and blood-stained road still mutely screamed the terror of their last stand. If any justification was needed for merciless reprisal, this graveyard offered it. Resisting those darkest impulses, Harris led his team to the central square and waited, exposed but hopeful. No shadows stirred to offer harm, but neither did any emerge to accept parley. The outreach seemed destined for silence. After long, futile minutes, Lieutenant Torres' voice crackled over the radio. "Sir, multiple targets converging on your 6, recommend immediate withdrawal." Before Harris could respond, alien shrieks pierced the stillness as a hunting pack entered the square, wicked blades glinting. Harris stood firm, hands still extended in peace as the creatures slowly fanned out to encircle them. He slowly enunciated the translated greeting, never breaking eye contact with the foremost alien. But its blank carapace betrayed nothing. They remained poised on the knife edge of conflict. Just as Harris prepared to signal withdrawal, the aliens parted to allow another of their kind to pass through. This one moved with confident authority, its chitinous form bedecked with strange ornamentation. Some kind of elder or leader, Harris guessed. Only one way now to know if discourse was possible. "We seek reconciliation, not retribution," Harris stated slowly in translation as the alien fixed its unreadable black eyes on him. "Our peoples could both thrive here." He extended his open hand. For endless moments the figure only stared back, making no visible acknowledgement. Then, with sudden violent fury, it reared up and slashed Harris' torso with razor claws before unleashing its own garbled cry. Harris fell back stunned, blood pouring freely from the deep gashes. Around him, the other aliens stepped forward, spear tips leveled in unison at the exposed team. There would be no discourse or diplomacy this day, only violence bred by primal hatred and misunderstanding. Harris had gambled for peace and now paid the terrible price. The rest could only come swiftly. But just as alien weapons tensed to fire, searing bolts blasted down from the ridge, scattering the mob. Lieutenant Torres and the strike team charged into the square, laying down withering cover fire even as they encircled Harris protectively. Together they beat back the enemy through sheer audacity, rage and firepower, finally clearing an escape path back up the slope while aliens still fell trying to press the attack. From the rear, Miguel helped drag a dazed Harris to safety through the chaos. Pursuit did not come this time. Back atop the ridge, Akiko hastily sealed the ugly gashes while Torres demanded retaliation. But Harris only shook his head sadly, a lesson clear now at bitter cost. "There can be no common ground with them," he said solemnly. When argument persisted, Harris drew himself up rigidly. "We will defend what is ours if they attack again," he declared, allowing no dissent. "But our colony will not survive here solely by the sword. Ready the crew to depart." Below, in the valley, the masked aliens now howled their hunting calls from the shadows once more. But the crew had learned again the primacy of their own humanity. They would seek a new home beyond this conflict, or die striving. The future remained unwritten while their spirit endured. Leaning wearily into Akiko's shoulder, Harris let his grateful people bear him up and away from the bloody square. A captain's place was ahead, always forward even when disillusioned by the present. Eyes fixed ahead, Harris gestured the column onward. If no peace was possible here, their destiny lay elsewhere. They would walk on in hope. Chapter 21. Captain Harris sat upon a rocky overlook, gazing west across the lush plain that now cradled New Terra Nova. In only a few short years since they abandoned that first polluted valley, the industrious colonists had labored to transform this wild land into a self-sustaining settlement, fields and pastures interwoven with hydroponic farms, buzzing workshops clustered near the mines, orderly cabins radiating out from the civic heart they had together built from nothing. And atop every roof and tower flew the banners of Earth and colony both, proud symbols to remind them who and why they persevered. The defiant outpost remained fragile, still vulnerable to the planet's threats and treasures both. But they were embedded at last in this world's very bones, no longer marking days of survival, but lives now rooted here through commitment to each other. And gazing upon the golden sunset gilding colony rooftops, Harris knew in his heart this was the true threshold. What had simply been untouched terrain was sanctuary now to call their own. They had arrived home. Footsteps behind him brought Harris from his contemplation. He turned to see Akiko approaching, her ever-calm smile somehow brighter since their victory over the wilderness. She paused beside him, wordlessly sharing the vista that spread below. "I do not think any landscape could be more beautiful than this," she said at last. "We have saved ourselves through determined faith. The generations who sacrificed before would stand in awe." Harris nodded solemnly, thinking of all who had given lives to bring them to this moment, and those yet unborn whose future depended on preserving those fragile gains. For their sake, their community must embody unity and justice as sure as the walls and fields. He turned to Akiko with sudden decision. "Will you walk with me? There are thoughts I would share." At her wordless nod, Harris led the way along a winding path down toward the colony center. Citizens paused to bow respect as Harris passed, faces etched with hardship, but eyes now alight with shared purpose. Each had given uniquely to forge this refuge. In their hands lay the power to keep or lose it all. In the open amphitheater that served as their public forum and hall, Harris ascended the speaking platform. At his signal, the radio operator transmitted the summons for all citizens to gather here. Soon the seats filled with community members, gazing up at him expectantly. The responsibility of leadership weighed fully upon Harris as he prepared to share the convictions their sacrifices had coaxed from his own soul. When all had quieted, he began resolutely. "Fellow citizens, from our first days here, I called on you to prevail against threat and temptation alike through force of arms and sheer will." Murmurs greeted this acknowledgement of their defiant rise from the ashes. "But we have progressed now beyond those desperate times," Harris continued. "Survival alone is not enough. A just order, governance, and liberty are also required to become whole." He surveyed the crowd, letting his words sink in before proceeding. Power cannot serve only itself, lest we become the very tyranny we fled. Leaders must be accountable to citizens, and law bind all equally. Only in embracing fairness for all can we transcend division. On he spoke passionately, envisioning a society responsive to dissenting voices, where policies were founded on consensus and inclusive wisdom. There were nods and objections both, but all listened intently. These people had seen humanity's light and shadow warring. They would not take Harris' hard-won convictions lightly. As Harris enumerated the reforms he planned to enact, ensuring rights and representation across the settlement, he felt the full weight of responsibility like never before. He was abdicating unchecked authority, with no assurance the grand experiment would succeed. But the trying mattered. Their future must be written together. When he descended from the podium, the assembled colonists sat silently absorbing his words. Harris remained among them, sharing silently in this moment of epochal change. Their fate balanced on understanding both the precious worth of community and its fragility. In unity, there was life. At last they rose and approached Harris solemnly, one by one. Some still seemed fearful of what the new compact required, but none rejected it outright. They pressed Harris' hand and saluted the principles he had fought so hard to defend and expand. Their own mettle would be tested now as well. As the last citizen stepped forward, Harris felt Akiko's steadying hand on his shoulder. All around them, the people spoke softly but earnestly of the future. Familiar faces shone with new light and possibility. Out of the ashes, something nobler than before was being kindled. And side by side, they would carry the spark forward wherever it led. Their journey was not over, but they walked it together. Epilogue. Captain Harris 4 gazed out the viewport of the orbital shuttle as it made its final approach toward the glinting space station above New Terra Nova. He smiled to himself, reflecting on how far the colony had come in the century since his ancestor had led those first refugees here. The plains below were crisscrossed by roads and mag rail lines connecting bustling cities. Rivers that had watered wild crops now powered hydroelectric dams and fueled sprawling fusion plants. Where open sky had once loomed empty, now commerce ships and leisure vessels darted between burgeoning space elevator tethers. The frontier outpost was a thriving world now. As the shuttle docked smoothly at the orbital hub, Harris stepped out into the bustle of the station concourse. Citizens of all quarters hurried purposefully about, administrators, pilots, technicians, diplomats. He nodded respectfully to a group of traders whose ancestors had been among those original pioneers. In their faces, he saw the shared heritage of courage that had made this prosperity possible. Harris' duties today were to welcome the ambassador from Proxima Centauri, the first official state visit here by their nearest stellar neighbor. Another step toward the unity his forebear had so passionately advocated. As he walked briskly to the reception hall, Harris mulled again the immortal words handed down to him. Civilization is not defined by the strength of walls or weapons. It is only as just, wise, and inclusive as the hearts of those within. We must govern through hope and healing, not fear or force. In unity, there is life. However heavy the burden of leadership weighed at times, the wisdom of his ancestors roused Harris to meet each new trial or threat through compassion and care for every citizen. The darkness of survival at all costs would not consume them, while those words yet resonated in worthy souls. As the ambassador's shuttle arrived to much pomp and fanfare, Harris straightened to receive her. An honor guard stood proudly behind him, rifles ceremonial, but ready if called upon. He stepped forward as the hatch opened, mind focused only on warm greeting. But suddenly, his vision wavered, voices around him muffling oddly. Disorientation nearly caused him to stumble before the episode passed. Harris shook his head, trying to clear the residual fog that seemed to linger. He must be more tired than he realized. The impression faded as the ambassador disembarked. Harris bowed graciously, welcoming the dignitary who represented so much progress toward harmony. Cameras flashed and proud banners waved in the hangar breeze. On the surface below, citizens cheered at the images of this milestone being broadcast live across the planet. Captain Harris smiled for those watching, letting his posture and face convey the hope and pride welling within. However ephemeral, this moment shone brilliant with possibility if they kept faith. Let cynics and fear-mongers dwell on old threats and divisions. The future belonged to dreamers bold enough to transcend them. As Harris humbly showed the way forward, the ambassador followed in unity. Around the planet, around the system, crowds rose in celebration of the bonds being forged this day. Barriers were crumbling, old grudges fading. An era of peace was dawning at last. Watching this auspicious scene, Harris felt his chest swell with profound gratitude. To witness the flowering of generations of struggle and sacrifice so that all might prosper together, this was the greatest honor he could imagine. Not all who came before had lived to see it, but their spirits surely rejoiced with him now at the bounty their hard sacrifices had sown. This shining moment was their shared validation. The captain had led humanity home. The end.